At 5 in the morning, the neighborhood was ripped awake by the shrill screech of a whistle. It wasn't a car alarm or a stray cat in a garbage can. It was Karen, wrapped in a pink robe, hair rollers gleaming under the streetlight. She marched up and down the cul-de-sac with the authority of a drill sergeant who had lost her patience decades ago. She blew the whistle again, long and merciless, then shouted into the dawn that someone's grass had grown a quarter-inch above regulation. Curtains parted. Dogs barked. A man watering his begonias in his underwear dropped the hose in defeat. By the time the sun peeked over the roofs, everyone already knew. Karen had found her latest victim. That was how she liked to start her days, by reminding the neighborhood that the lawns must be perfect or there would be consequences. Jason had not planned to move into a war zone when he bought his little yellow house at the end of the block. He had imagined weekends on the porch with a beer, the sound of kids on bicycles, maybe the occasional barbecue with friendly neighbors. What he got was a handwritten notice tucked under his windshield on his second morning. The note read in bold black marker, "Gnome violation section 3A of the bylaws." He stared at his new lawn ornament, a chipped garden gnome with a crooked red hat, and wondered what kind of community considered such a harmless figure an abomination. He didn't have to wonder long. Karen appeared, clipboard in hand, pointing her pen at the gnome as if she were a prosecutor delivering evidence in a high-profile trial. "That ornament is an eyesore," she declared, her voice carrying across the lawns like a church bell no one had asked for. Jason laughed at first, thinking it a joke. It was not. The neighborhood whispered about her like a ghost story. There was the couple who painted their shutters an unapproved shade of blue and woke up the next morning to find Karen had taped a paint sample to their door with a note insisting immediate correction. There was old Mr. Ramirez, fined 3 times in a single month for letting a dandelion escape into view. Children dared each other to run across Karen's front yard, a place where grass was trimmed to surgical precision, every blade seemingly measured with a ruler. Rumor said she kept a pair of scissors in her robe pocket for emergency snips. Whether true or not, no one dared test her. Jason's clash began small but grew with absurd speed. First the gnome, then a warning about his mailbox, which she claimed was a shade too glossy. The third offense was a supposed crack in his driveway, invisible to the human eye unless viewed under the scrutiny of Karen's magnifying glass. Each time he received a violation, it came with a threat of escalating fines. Each time he felt the surreal sense that he had accidentally wandered into a parody of suburbia that refused to admit it was a parody. But the more he tried to ignore her, the more determined she became to break him. It was at a neighborhood barbecue that Jason truly understood the depth of Karen's reign. The air was heavy with smoke from grilled hot dogs. Kids chased each other with water balloons, and for a moment everything seemed normal. Then Karen appeared, clipboard in tow even at a social gathering, and announced that all residents needed to sign a new amendment requiring lawns to be fertilized with a specific brand she had deemed most pleasing. People shifted uncomfortably, plates of potato salad suspended halfway to their mouths. No one challenged her. Not until Jason, still nursing the sting of his third violation, raised his hand and asked if this was a democracy or a monarchy with mulch. The silence that followed was heavy enough to choke on. Karen's smile froze, her pen hovering midair. Later, Jason overheard neighbors whispering that he would regret poking the bear. The next morning he found a bright orange notice taped to his garage. Unauthorized wind chime noise disturbance. He didn't even own wind chimes. The accusations were now entirely fabricated. When he knocked on her door to protest, Karen opened it only wide enough to glare at him through the gap, her cat hissing in perfect harmony with her disapproval. She informed him that any attempt to appeal his violations would require presenting his case before the HOA tribunal. Jason blinked, wondering if she had just invented a medieval-sounding court to intimidate him. But from the way she said it, and the grim nods of neighbors who had gathered to watch, the tribunal was real. That night he sat on his porch, staring at the crooked hat of his outlawed gnome, and tried to make sense of what he had stumbled into. The quiet cul-de-sac had a darkness beneath its trimmed hedges and flower beds. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was orchestrating fear, keeping everyone under her thumb with a mix of absurdity and menace. Yet there was also something oddly comical in her tyranny. The way she wielded her whistle like a royal scepter. The way she scribbled notes with the intensity of a crime scene investigator. Jason realized he was laughing even as he worried about what she might do next. And in that uneasy mix of dread and humor, he sensed the start of a battle that would either break him or remake the neighborhood forever. The whispers of past victims grew louder. An older woman across the street leaned over her fence one afternoon and whispered that her husband had once been fined for leaving the wrong kind of pumpkin on the porch in October. Another neighbor hinted that Karen's rules sometimes contradicted the official HOA handbook, suggesting she had written her own amendments and slipped them in unnoticed. Jason began to suspect there was more at play than eccentric perfectionism. Perhaps Karen had motives that went beyond neat lawns. Perhaps the tribunal was not just a formality but part of a larger system of control she had engineered. The idea unsettled him, but it also sparked something inside him. Curiosity, defiance, and maybe the faint thrill of rebellion. By the end of his first week in the neighborhood, Jason was no longer thinking of quiet weekends with a beer. He was thinking of strategy. He didn't know if he could win against someone who had ruled the cul-de-sac with iron and fertilizer for years. But he knew one thing. The lawns might have to be perfect, but so far Karen had not met anyone willing to fight her with equal stubbornness. As he stared again at the little gnome on his grass, Jason smiled grimly. The battle had already begun, and the first shot had been fired at dawn with the blast of a whistle. Jason soon discovered that Karen's violations weren't just annoying scraps of paper. They were weapons in a system she had carefully engineered. One morning he found a fat packet shoved into his mailbox. It was labeled with official-looking seals and the words Homeowners Association Bylaws, Revised Edition. At first glance it looked legitimate, a heavy stack of legalese designed to intimidate. But as Jason flipped through, his brow furrowed. He saw clauses that seemed oddly specific, like the requirement that only shade number 34 of green could be used for lawn chairs, or that garage doors must open and close within 8 seconds to avoid disrupting community rhythm. Some were written so vaguely they could mean anything, like all holiday decorations must be in good taste. Jason knew good taste, according to Karen, probably meant plastic angels lined up like soldiers. It struck him that half of these rules were likely inventions she had slipped in unnoticed. The neighbors accepted them as gospel because no one wanted to question the self-appointed priestess of suburban law. That suspicion deepened when he overheard two neighbors whispering at dusk near the row of mailboxes. They were talking about a meeting later that night, one Jason hadn't been invited to. He followed from a distance and found them gathering in Karen's garage. The door was cracked just enough for him to peer inside. What he saw wasn't a normal meeting with minutes and motions. It was more like a ritual. A long folding table was covered in binders and clipboards, each labeled with categories like shrubbery, driveways, fences, seasonal infractions. Karen stood at the head, banging a ruler against the table for silence. The residents sat in rows like obedient pupils. Karen called out offenses, and the group murmured approval like a choir. At one point, she raised a Polaroid of Jason's mailbox and asked the room if it was too reflective under sunlight. The chorus answered yes in uneasy unison. Jason had to cover his mouth to stop from laughing. It was absurd, and yet the seriousness on their faces made it terrifying. This wasn't just an HOA. It was a cult with Karen as high priestess. The next morning, Jason decided to fight back, but he quickly realized he couldn't do it alone. He began quietly talking to neighbors when Karen wasn't around, probing for cracks in their loyalty. Some were too scared to speak, afraid of fines or worse, but others hinted at resentment. Mr. Ramirez, the dandelion victim, told Jason in a hushed tone that he had been paying fines for months without a single appeal granted. A young couple admitted they were thinking of moving because Karen had disapproved of their Christmas lights for being too cheerful. Jason saw an opportunity. If he could gather enough allies, maybe they could challenge her authority. But Karen seemed to sense his attempts. That same afternoon, he found another violation taped to his door, this one accusing him of unauthorized laughter exceeding acceptable decibel levels. He didn't know whether to scream or laugh harder. Karen escalated with alarming precision. Within a week, Jason had racked up more fines than his mortgage payment. Each notice felt more ridiculous than the last. Improper grass clippings arrangement, unsanctioned bird feeder placement, even an accusation that his recycling bin had been angled too provocatively toward the street. Neighbors began avoiding him in public, afraid her wrath might spread to them if they were seen speaking to him. It was like living under a dictatorship where a gnome or a misplaced flower pot could cost you everything. Yet Jason refused to bow. He took the notices, stacked them neatly on his kitchen counter, and plotted. The absurdity fueled him as much as the injustice. He had moved into this cul-de-sac to start fresh, but now he felt like fate had dropped him into the heart of a bizarre suburban battlefield. And he wasn't about to surrender. One evening, he returned home to find a letter slipped under his door. Unlike Karen's notices, this one was typed on plain paper with no official seal. It read simply, "We are with you. Meet us at midnight near the community pool." Intrigued, Jason went. There he found a small group of neighbors huddled in the shadows. They were nervous, whispering like conspirators, glancing over their shoulders as if Karen's whistle might pierce the night at any moment. They introduced themselves as residents who had suffered under Karen's reign but had been too afraid to fight back. They shared stories. Pumpkins confiscated, basketball hoops dismantled, pets threatened with expulsion. Jason felt both outrage and relief. He wasn't alone. Together, they decided they would push back. They would expose her fabricated bylaws, challenge her authority, and free the neighborhood from her grip. Felt like the start of a rebellion, small and fragile, but alive. Yet the rebellion carried risks. Karen seemed to have eyes everywhere. The next day, Jason caught her staring at him from behind her curtain, her cat's glowing eyes beside her like an accomplice. Later, he noticed a suspicious SUV parked at the end of the street, its occupant pretending to read a newspaper while occasionally snapping photos of lawns. Surveillance? Or just his paranoia taking root? Either way, the tension was suffocating. It wasn't just about lawns anymore. It was about control, about whether people could breathe freely in their own homes. Jason realized the stakes were higher than he'd thought. This wasn't going to be settled with a polite conversation at a meeting. It was going to be war. The revelation came in the form of a hidden clause buried deep in the revised handbook. Jason found it one night while combing through the absurd rules, his eyes blurring from legal jargon. The clause stated that any homeowner with 3 or more violations could be referred to the HOA tribunal for a disciplinary hearing that could result in forced property sale. His stomach dropped. That was why she was piling notices on him so fast. She wasn't just trying to annoy him. She was trying to drive him out. It wasn't paranoia. It was strategy. Karen wanted his house gone, and the tribunal was her weapon. Armed with this knowledge, Jason knew he had little time left. Either he exposed her scheme or he would lose everything. The neighborhood, his home, even his dignity. And though the absurdity of it all made him want to laugh, the danger was real. He saw now that Karen's reign wasn't built on silly fines and whistle blasts alone. It was built on fear, manipulation, and the quiet compliance of neighbors too weary to resist. If he wanted to survive, he would need courage, allies, and maybe a little mischief. The lawns might have to be perfect, but Karen's empire was showing cracks. Jason was determined to push until the whole facade collapsed. Jason woke up to find his front yard covered in pink flamingos. Not a dozen, not even 50. Hundreds. They were jammed into the soil in uneven rows, a tacky army standing at attention. A note was taped to his door that read Decorative Infestation Section 7B immediate removal required. He didn't know whether to laugh or scream. On the one hand, it was so absurd that it was almost beautiful, the kind of scene that would have made a perfect postcard titled Welcome to Suburbia. On the other hand, he knew exactly who had orchestrated it. Karen had struck again. She was escalating from fines to psychological warfare. The neighbors watched from their porches, some hiding smiles, others shaking their heads in pity. Jason realized this was no longer about one homeowner versus an HOA president. This was about rebellion. And rebellions, even in cul-de-sacs, needed to start with a spark. He began recruiting. It wasn't easy. Many of the neighbors were too scared, convinced Karen would punish their entire families if they joined him. But a few were brave enough or desperate enough to risk her wrath. Mr. Ramirez signed on quickly, grinning as he confessed he had been waiting years for someone to challenge her. The young couple with the two cheerful Christmas lights joined too, whispering that they couldn't take another winter in Karen's dictatorship. Even the man with the begonias in his underwear offered his support, though he warned he wasn't much of a strategist. Jason assured him strategy wasn't as important as solidarity. Slowly, their little alliance began to grow. The first act of resistance was small but symbolic. Jason and his allies agreed to leave their trash bins out past the acceptable collection window, violating one of Karen's most beloved rules. It was ridiculous, the kind of offense most neighborhoods would ignore. But here it was an act of defiance. When the sun rose and Karen marched down the street with her clipboard, her eyes widened at the sight of bins still lined up on curbs. She scribbled furiously, blowing her whistle like a referee at a rigged game. Yet Jason noticed something important. The neighbors didn't look ashamed. They looked amused. They smiled at each other behind her back. For the first time, people weren't afraid. They were entertained. And entertainment was contagious. Karen retaliated with surveillance. She installed cameras on her property that just happened to face every angle of Jason's house. She accused him of harboring weeds and demanded weekly photo evidence of his lawn's condition. When he refused, she launched what she called Operation Lawn Perfection. Suddenly, he spotted strange figures skulking around the neighborhood at night, snapping photos of grass blades, measuring fence heights, and peeking over hedges. It was absurd, but it was also invasive. Jason felt like he was living under martial law enforced by gardeners. Yet every new attempt by Karen only fueled his resolve. He began to think of their battle as a bizarre chess game where the pieces were trash bins, flamingos, and gnomes. The prank war escalated when one of Jason's allies, the Christmas light couple, decided to decorate their roof in July with blinking reindeer and neon snowmen. The display glowed so brightly it could be seen from the freeway. Karen nearly collapsed at the sight, shrieking about seasonal violations and threatening fines that could fund a small nation. But the neighborhood laughed. They gathered on lawns with lawn chairs and drinks, clapping when the lights blinked into a garish rhythm. Felt like freedom. For once, laughter was louder than Karen's whistle. Jason realized something powerful was happening. The more ridiculous their resistance became, the more it weakened Karen's authority. People were rediscovering joy in defiance. The breaking point came when Karen's prized rose bushes were vandalized. Jason swore he hadn't done it, and his allies denied involvement. The bushes were her crown jewels, pruned to symmetrical perfection and fertilized with a secret recipe she guarded like state secrets. One morning they were found hacked to pieces, petals scattered like confetti across her yard. Karen's scream was heard 2 streets over. She accused Jason immediately, presenting the tribunal with a Polaroid of him holding gardening shears. The problem was Jason had never owned those shears. The photo looked staged, almost comically fake. But Karen's allies treated it as evidence nonetheless. The tribunal issued a warning that if Jason continued his campaign of rebellion, he would face removal from the neighborhood. Jason realized she was willing to fabricate proof to destroy him. This was no longer a game. It was war with real consequences. Karen's lawsuits arrived next. Official-looking documents appeared on Jason's doorstep, accusing him of defamation, harassment, and unapproved decorative choices. The claims were laughable, but they were also terrifying. Legal battles could ruin him, and she knew it. Yet even as the papers piled up, Jason noticed something shifting in the air. Neighbors began approaching him in secret, whispering their support. They brought snacks to his porch, slipped notes of encouragement under his door, and offered to testify if things came to court. For every weapon Karen used, Jason gained more sympathy. Her iron rule was starting to crack under the weight of its own absurdity. The night of the community potluck sealed the turning point. Karen stood at the head of the tables, clipboard in one hand, microphone in the other, preparing to announce new regulations on casserole sizes. But Jason's allies had prepared a surprise. As she cleared her throat, the crowd erupted in a chorus of whistles, drowning her out with the very sound she had used to control them. The look on her face was priceless, part fury, part disbelief. She shouted into the microphone, demanding order, but the whistles grew louder, joined by laughter and applause. For the first time, Karen was the one silenced. Jason watched her retreat from the crowd, her power suddenly fragile, and felt a surge of hope. The revolt had officially begun. That night, as he sat on his porch with his outlawed gnome and his growing stack of violations, Jason realized the neighborhood was on the edge of something bigger than lawn disputes. They were fighting for dignity, for the right to laugh, for the freedom to plant dandelions if they pleased. Karen still held power, but it was slipping through her fingers. And Jason, against all odds, had become the reluctant leader of a suburban uprising. He smiled at the absurdity of it all. In any other place, this would be madness. But here, in this cul-de-sac, it was destiny. The neighborhood was no longer quiet. Every cul-de-sac morning began with murmurs of strategy, sideways glances, and the sound of Karen's whistle clashing against the laughter of Jason's allies. The once placid suburb had become a battlefield divided by trimmed hedges and cracked sidewalks. Families were choosing sides. Some continued to cling to Karen's iron rules, terrified of the chaos that freedom might bring. Others rallied behind Jason, inspired by the sheer absurdity of resisting through pink flamingos and neon reindeer. Lawns became signals of allegiance. Those perfectly symmetrical, ruler-measured yards screamed loyalty to Karen, while the slightly wild, creatively decorated ones stood in rebellion. It was no longer just about lawns. It was about survival in a suburban civil war. Jason's group held secret meetings in Mr. Ramirez's garage, the smell of oil and old lawnmower parts mixing with the tension of whispered plans. They discussed strategies ranging from collective refusal to pay fines to staging a mock trial exposing Karen's fabricated bylaws. Each plan carried risks. Karen had spies, people willing to report the smallest hint of defiance for her approval. They suspected even the kids riding scooters might have been bribed with ice cream to relay information. Still, spirits were high. Jason realized he wasn't just a reluctant leader anymore. He had become the face of the movement, and whether he wanted it or not, the neighborhood was looking to him to finish what he had started. Karen, for her part, was not retreating. She doubled down with terrifying efficiency. She introduced a new initiative she called the Master Plan for Community Perfection. Flyers appeared in every mailbox, printed on heavy cardstock with gold lettering. The plan outlined a future where all homes would conform to a single architectural style, where lawns would be inspected weekly by professional landscapers paid for through increased HOA dues, and where violations would result not just in fines, but in mandatory correction programs. The language was polished, even seductive, but the meaning was clear. She wanted total control. She was no longer content with her whistle and clipboard. She was building an empire. The announcement split the neighborhood further. Some residents welcomed the plan, seduced by promises of increased property values and prestige. Others recoiled at the thought of losing every scrap of individuality. Jason saw the line being drawn in the grass, and he knew there was no turning back. He began working with his allies to gather evidence of her corruption. Fake photos, made-up bylaws, and the fabricated tribunal system. They planned to reveal it all at the next community vote. If they could prove Karen's manipulation, they might finally topple her reign. But Karen had her own moves ready. She wasn't just playing defense. She was setting traps. The first trap came in the form of sabotage. Jason returned home one evening to find his gnome smashed into pieces, its red hat scattered across the driveway. A note pinned to the remains read Community Improvement. He felt a mix of rage and grief. That gnome had become a symbol, a tiny soldier in his rebellion, and now it was gone. When his allies gathered that night, they found similar acts of intimidation had spread. Ramirez's dandelions had been uprooted. The Christmas light couple's neon snowmen were stolen. Even the underwear begonia man reported that his plants had been sprayed with weed killer. It was clear. Karen was trying to break their spirit. For a moment, doubt crept in. Jason wondered if they had underestimated her willingness to destroy anything in her way. But then something unexpected happened. The neighborhood kids, usually silent observers, decided to take sides. They organized a parade of bicycles covered in streamers, blasting music from portable speakers. They chanted Jason's name as they rode past Karen's house, circling her manicured lawn like playful vultures. Karen stormed out with her whistle, but the kids drowned her out with honking bike horns. Parents watched, torn between pride and fear, but Jason saw the effect immediately. The laughter returned. Even in the face of intimidation, joy was their weapon. And joy was hard to kill. The community vote arrived, and the turnout was the largest anyone could remember. Folding chairs filled the community center, and tension hung heavy in the air. Karen stood at the front, poised and polished, her stack of bylaws beside her like holy scripture. Jason sat among his allies, clutching the evidence they had gathered. The vote would determine whether Karen's master plan would be implemented. It was the climax of their suburban war. Karen spoke first, delivering a rousing speech about order, beauty, and the sanctity of property values. She painted a picture of a perfect neighborhood unmarred by weeds, cracks, or holiday cheer. Many nodded, hypnotized by her authority. Then Jason rose. His voice shook at first, but it grew stronger as he spoke. He described the absurd violations, the fabricated rules, the intimidation and sabotage. He held up the fake Polaroid, the ridiculous clause about laughing too loudly, the stack of notices accusing him of crimes no sane community would recognize. He laid it all bare, daring the crowd to see the truth. The room shifted. People glanced at each other, whispering, frowning. Karen's mask of control cracked for the first time. She interrupted, shouting that Jason was lying, but her desperation only fueled his case. When he finished, the room was buzzing with doubt. The vote proceeded in silence. The result stunned everyone. The master plan was rejected by a narrow margin. Cheers erupted from Jason's side, while Karen's loyalists sat in stunned disbelief. But Jason's victory was bittersweet. As he basked in the relief, he noticed something troubling. One of his closest allies, the Christmas light husband, avoided his gaze. Later that night, Jason discovered why. The man had been secretly feeding information to Karen, terrified she would expose an old financial secret if he didn't comply. The betrayal cut deep. Jason realized the war wasn't over. Karen might have lost the vote, but she still had weapons hidden, allies planted, and secrets to exploit. The Civil War had only entered its bloodiest stage. As Jason walked home under the glow of streetlights, he felt the weight of leadership pressing harder than ever. The lawns were scarred, the fences strained, the laughter quieter than before. Karen had been wounded, but she wasn't defeated. He knew the final battle was coming, and it would be more ruthless than anything yet. The gnome was gone, the neighborhood fractured, and the stakes had risen beyond lawns and mailboxes. Now it was about trust, betrayal, and the future of the community itself. And as he passed Karen's house, her curtains twitched, and he caught the glint of her eyes watching him in the dark. The war wasn't finished. It was only gathering fire. The final showdown began with rain. It was the kind of storm that soaked everything in minutes, pounding against rooftops and filling gutters with rushing water. Thunder rolled across the cul-de-sac like a war drum, and it felt fitting. After months of absurd battles, whispered conspiracies, and escalating hostilities, the neighborhood was ready for its last reckoning. At the center of it all stood the community center, its fluorescent lights glowing against the gray. Inside, every chair was filled. Residents sat in tense silence, clutching papers, whispering suspicions, glancing nervously toward the front where Karen stood with her ever-present clipboard. Jason sat in the second row, his heart hammering. He had gathered his evidence, rallied his allies, and prepared his arguments. But he knew this night wouldn't be settled with documents alone. It would be settled with truths that had been buried for years. Karen opened the meeting with a speech that was sharper and colder than ever. She declared that the community had fallen into chaos under Jason's influence. She blamed him for vandalism, for disrespect, for tearing apart the unity she claimed to have built. She held up photographs, some doctored, some genuine, each one painting him as a reckless agitator. The tribunal, assembled behind her like judges, nodded gravely. Jason waited until she finished, then rose to speak. His voice cut through the murmurs. He described the fabricated bylaws, the intimidation, the absurd violations that no sane community should enforce. He held up his thick stack of notices, each one more ridiculous than the last, and asked the room if this was the kind of life they wanted. Some residents looked away, ashamed. Others nodded with cautious support. The balance was delicate. But the twist came when an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Latham, stood up from the back row. She was usually quiet, barely noticed at meetings, but now her voice rang with conviction. She revealed that she had once served on the HOA board years ago, before Karen had taken control. She explained how Karen had quietly rewritten bylaws, removing pages from the original handbook and slipping in her own rules. She spoke of intimidation, of neighbors pressured into silence, of fines collected but never recorded in official accounts. The room gasped. For the first time, the tribunal looked uncertain. Jason hadn't expected this. He had hoped to sway the crowd with evidence, but Mrs. Latham's testimony cracked the facade in a way nothing else could. Karen turned pale, then furious, slamming her clipboard against the table and shouting that the old woman was senile. But the damage was done. The storm outside intensified, rattling the windows as if nature itself wanted to be part of the drama. Jason pressed his advantage. He called on others to share their stories, and one by one they did. Mr. Ramirez described his endless dandelion finds. The Christmas light couple admitted their decorations had been torn down by Karen herself in the middle of the night. Even the begonia man, usually indifferent, confessed that Karen had once threatened to fine him for owning indecent lawn chairs. The room buzzed with anger, and for the first time, Karen looked cornered. Yet she wasn't finished. With a dramatic flourish, she revealed her final card. She produced a legal document showing she had registered the HOA as a nonprofit under her sole authority, giving her broad powers to act on its behalf. The crowd gasped. It looked like she had locked in her reign permanently. Jason felt despair creeping in, but then he noticed something in the document as she waved it around. The registration date. It was recent, only weeks old. He seized the moment, pointing out that Karen had filed it without the required approval of the board or the community. It was invalid, an act of fraud. The tribunal members huddled, whispering furiously. Karen shouted, demanding order, but her voice was drowned out by the storm and the rising noise of angry neighbors. When the tribunal returned, their faces were grim. They announced that Karen's registration was illegitimate and that she was suspended from all HOA authority pending investigation. The room erupted in cheers. For the first time, Karen's clipboard slipped from her hand. But the true surprise came after. As Karen stormed out, her cat darting behind her, Jason followed into the rain-soaked parking lot. He wanted to see her reaction up close. She turned to him, her face illuminated by lightning, and for a moment she looked less like a tyrant and more like a broken woman. She confessed, not loudly but in a voice raw with bitterness, that she had never meant for it to go this far. She had once been humiliated by a previous HOA board for letting her grass grow too long during a rough time in her life. She had sworn never to be powerless again. What had started as a desire for respect had twisted into obsession, control, and fear. Jason listened, stunned. He almost pitied her. Almost. But he also knew the damage she had done. The next week, the neighborhood began to heal. Lawns grew a little wilder, decorations popped up without fear, and laughter returned to porches. Jason's allies became friends, and the community center felt lighter without Karen's whistle echoing through its halls. Yet the story didn't end neatly. Some residents still grumbled, afraid of slipping property values or longing for the rigid order Karen had enforced. The scars of the Civil War remained. Jason himself felt changed. He had moved into a quiet neighborhood and ended up leading a rebellion. It was absurd, exhausting, and strangely empowering. He realized he had grown roots, not just in his lawn but in the lives of his neighbors. They were a community now, imperfect but free. One final twist arrived on a calm evening weeks later. Jason found a small package on his porch. Inside was a repaired garden gnome, its hat glued back on, its cracks filled in with care. There was no note, only the faint smell of roses lingering on the box. He looked across the street toward Karen's darkened house. The curtains didn't move. The whistle didn't blow. But Jason understood. She was gone, stripped of power, but not entirely without humanity. He set the gnome back on his lawn, crooked hat and all, and smiled. The lawns might never be perfect, but the neighborhood was finally alive.